I want to shift a little bit to your experience doing field work. You mentioned that Jamaat members didn't treat you as neutral observers, but as someone who should be morally transformed. What did it feel like to become the object of Dawat in the field?
Yeah, no, that's so yeah, that's a big part of the book, and thank you, you brought it up. It's a theme. I argue that this is in ethnography. I call it in the space of cultural intimacy, and one of the reasons I frame it that way is because I really do think like these divides between liberal, secular, and Islamic, they exist. We know they exist, secular, Mark.
Yeah.
There are all of these ways in which we're all related to each other, right? Our cousins are Tablighis, and I met Marxists who speak in the almost in an idiom that sounds like Tablighis, and then you find out his brother is in the Tablighi Jamaat. So Pakistan is full of these kinds of possibilities of
Yeah.
interactions that cannot be boxed, I think, in the way that we box them. And so I argue that, this is anthropology in the space of cultural intimacy in the sense that these are transformative possibilities, right? There are transformative possibilities of somebody being secular and becoming part of a Tablighi movement, or somebody becoming a Tablighi and then leaving it and becoming something entirely different. And so because they're modernities, see, if they were not modernities, if they didn't have some underlying structural similarities, right? You couldn't just transform from one to the other, but people do. And that already is a good sign that actually what we're dealing with are more intimate space. We're dealing with
Yeah.
intimate differences, right? I mean,
Yeah.
rather than really radical ruptures. And so I make an argument against radical alterity. So that's the kind of
Yeah.
broad frame. I do that through a story of a very good high school friend of mine, A-levels friend of mine,
Yeah.
who was a feature of the whole research process. So, in the Tablighi Jamaat, you're a Muslim. If you bring in a Muslim identity and maybe even a non-Muslim identity, obviously you're presupposed as somebody who is to be incorporated into this project, like all Muslims
Yeah.
are. And then you're there and you're present. And so you've already shown interest. But Tablighis have a very embodiment is not just an analytic category. Embodiment is a native category in the sense that the Tablighis themselves think about religion as non-intellectual, right? Like the
Yeah.
body that they construct as a site of the construct. So they say, oh, you cannot understand Islamic piety through the brain or Zen, right? They say, oh, it's not a dimaghi thing. It's not a thing of the mind only, right? It's a thing of the body. And so they have a theory of the body and the body's transformation is part of their religiosity. And so they saw my research as an obstacle to my realization of piety itself.
Yeah.
And so in that was a big part of my story was like understanding how Islamic piety is embodied has to take account of these kinds of differences that they themselves produce between mind and body and the formulation of the body as a site for this different kind of mindfulness, right? And so my
Yeah.
research was both ran against this ideology insofar as I was, on the one hand, asking too many questions, And so one of the things about the submission to authority, the recognition of authority, is not to become a speaker too soon. But I was always talking because I had questions, but they would say,
Yeah.
you cannot understand it like this. Islam is understood through orthopraxy, through
Yeah.
doing. So they would say this to me. And I was asking all these questions and I was making other people respond to questions intellectually. And so there was a whole theory that the devil is what manipulates the mind in such a way, or speech in such a way as to then make people raise questions. And so, in fact, I was I was myself. My ethnographic project was antithetical to the project of the materialization or production of a pious subjectivity. So
Yeah.
this was a tension that ran through my fieldwork, and I explore this tension because it actually gets at what it is when I say Tablighi Jamaat has a particular conception of the sphere of deen, of religion. This is the kind of tension that gets at that, right? The speaking subject is assuming authority, a self-authorized person as assuming authority that he doesn't or doesn't have at the moment, right? To speak in certain authoritative ways. And therefore,
Yeah.
I was, in a sense, seen as the same problem that they would see in liberalism, right? That it authorizes people. I think it's in keeping, I think, broadly with this, the Assadian point here that, but I don't take their ideology. I think that maybe one way in which to think about the differences, I think that when I start to ask this question about why does their piety get threatened and unravel by these questions, it does open some space for thinking about the limits of their own worldview, right? I don't reject their worldview as false entirely, but I also don't accept it as actually embodying the totality of the social truth, right? You can think about
Yeah.
this in the word we think about in Marxist tradition, ideology, right? Like it is ideology in the sense that it's not entirely false, but it also does not encompass the totality of the truth to which it is an attempt to engage. And so I think that that's one of the ways in which I was thinking about this problem. That didn't like I was a threat to that framework, right,
Yeah.
by virtue of my presence in that. And so I use myself as a vehicle for thinking about what are the things that threaten this formation, the social formation, this ethical formation.
And to expand on that further, so how did these like encounters reshape your fieldwork relationships? Not just like in terms of access, but in terms of like the ethics of doing fieldwork, and what kind of responsibilities did they place on you as a researcher, I guess you could say?
Well, they didn't want me to be a researcher. They wanted me to be
Yeah.
a not researcher. And I think that some of them understood and maybe were okay with it. Some of them found it extremely odd and threatening. And so I think that the idea was, of course, though, that I had a Tablighi Buzurg had in some way tacitly authorized me to be there because maybe I don't know, I can only speculate why, and I do speculate a bit about why, but in my book, which is that I think that there was a sense that I would eventually be affected by this in a way that would transform me in the way that they saw, and then I could myself become a vehicle for the transformation of others. And there is a class and caste kind of framework that I explore in the book as well. That like there is a desire to get people who are high up already in worldly kind of ways, right? Because those people have an influence on others, and if you can attract enough people like that, generals, army generals, or elites, or that can have a profound transformation on others around them, right? So it boosts the prestige value of the Jamaat. And so I think that maybe there were a lot of things going on and efforts to draw me in, and so I think that's what they approached. That is what most people thought would happen. I mean, otherwise, obviously I explore this in the book at length. There were personal relationships that I had with some of the people guiding me through my research as well. But I had decent relationships. I don't think that we developed these relationships. Obviously, I didn't include private things too many. I mean, things. I mean, I included what I felt I needed to include, but I also
Yeah.
wasn't trying to get into things that I really. So you manage that ethics in ethnography, and you try. It's not like I'm trying to expose some, but people in Pakistan in general think that when you're doing research, they think you're trying to get at some kind of secret thing. But actually, my research was on the surface of things, right? Like the
Yeah.
surfaces are what are interesting about,
There
and so
was
I was.
Yeah. No, I was just going to add that these accounts of Dawat are drawn from multiple people's stories. When does composition such as blending voices or moments feel more truthful than sticking to one person's account? And how do you decide when to compose in that way? And were
Yeah.
there
I,
any
I,
ethical considerations?
I'm not sure I wrote that. I don't recall but I do think that there is some blending, but it's not that much blending. I mean, it's not like
Oh,
but it is true that in ethnography there are somewhat composite characters. Right? That is to say,
okay.
you do like you hear so many things, and you can't tell a story about
Okay.
every single person, or you have to drive an account through events, right? Like this happened, and so
Okay.
so you
Yeah.
know things here and there, and you do that. I mean, you don't end up. I mean, I don't have any quotes of people that are not those
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Of course.
there's some level of story building and to create a coherent account. So I tell the students this all the time. This is true that you do need to build chapters around particular types of characters and particular types of people, and there are things that you're learning from your environment. But I mean the authenticity comes from, I mean, the quotations are almost like those are mostly
Yeah.
recorded either right there in notes, or some of
Okay.
them were actually interview recorded. So I think that, there are no completely like accounts of like one person, but all characters are somewhat composites, right? Because you
Yeah.
are, yeah. So I'd have to go through all the text particularly to see which parts
Yeah.
maybe somebody said it in a different place. The same person said it, but they said it in two different spaces. But you're not going to write a whole other scene over there, and then, so
Oh
you
yeah.
you kind of merge them. So that's how ethnography does work, and it isn't. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
it's not
Yeah.
certainly not like writing fiction. You are
Yeah.
writing about
Yeah.
real people who said real things to you in a real space, and events that happened are all, of course, very much. So there's a bit of
So
liberty, but there's not as much liberty as some people think there might be.
so returning to Dawat, your concept of moral chronotype, especially in your Polar article, describes how pious time collapses sacred past and aspirational future. What does this temporality do for Jamaat's members on the ground?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. That article is in, you've said Polar again, but it's in Science and Society.
Oh, science and
Uh,
society? I'll just write that
Um,
down.
but so that's one of the arguments I make, of course, is that there's this sort of temporality that's produced, right? This temporality of piety, both in the sense that I already said, which is this deference to the future, but also in the replication and reproduction of the prophet's time in this sort of relation. So the Tablighi Jamaat what do we call it? The anarchists call it. It's prefigurative politics, right? It's prefigurative in the sense that it shares that you're trying to produce the ideal society in the here and now as it was in the past, and trying to collapse the temporality of the present into that past, right? And you're trying to do that through embodied practice. And so
Yeah.
I draw on a lot of semiotic stuff, but I argue iconicity. Iconicity is basically signs that look like
Mhm.
things that look like other things, basically signs that are related to other things by a physical resemblance of sorts. So the Tablighi Jamaat is replicating the Sunnat, right? And so it's materializing the Prophet's time in the present, and through this kind of replication. And the interactional forms that I describe are replicating the relations between the Prophet and the companions, right? Which are also these tiered
Mhm.
relationships relative to the personage of the Prophet. And so yeah, I argue that kind of effort to replicate temporality. But then there's also this sort of futurism, which is that you don't really ever arrive at it, right? You kind of is a sort of deference of that to the future. What does it do? Well, one thing it does functionally, I argue, is that it affords a certain possibility for living in plural space. Is an argument I make in that one chapter.
Mhm.
That is to say that the ideal society would involve producing a family, community writ large, but a family also that already abides by the very strict terms of Islamic piety as they've been formulated in this tradition, Tablighi Jamaat and in the broader
Mhm.
Deobandi tradition. But families are, of course, mixed. They don't actually exist like that. People are actually willful, and
Mhm.
they don't all often have the same, even some people don't even, the same families don't even belong to the same denominations. And so there are all these
Mhm.
tensions that arrive in people's lives by virtue of their inability to realize the ideal form, right, of the family, which I argue it is about hierarchy of where familial hierarchy, which we're all familiar with in Pakistan, listening to your elders, your parents, your grandparents, that familial hierarchy, particularly the father's voice in a patriarchal structure, right, aligns with the hierarchy of the Tablighi congregation. Those two hierarchies must
Mhm.
align, which means that you have religious
Mhm.
authority, paternal authority, and then you, right? You should have this clear line of authority that goes from you to your parents to the elders of the. But this doesn't happen. These alignments don't happen, right? Relations are complex. We live in a complex plural social milieu, and with some of our most intimate relationships, those relationships that define who we are do not, in fact, materialize that. So this can produce anxiety and frustration. If you're
Mhm.
a Marxist, to put it simply, you're a Marxist, but your father is a card carrying capitalist, a certain kind of contradiction is produced inside of you, right? That contradiction can unravel in many directions, right? It can produce all kinds of things. So it's not different from any kind of social milieu where kinship is really important to the conception of the self and how other people perceive you. And so Tablighis have to manage this problem because they're trying to produce this idealized society and idealized state, but they run up against these social limits. And so one of the arguments I make is this notion of deference that is produced within the Tablighi Jamaat allows for a certain kind of acceptance of difference, acceptance of, because it's ultimately God that transforms people. And so there's a certain kind of deference, like maybe my father is not accepting of what I do, but maybe he will be in the future through the agency of God. So it structures their relationships to other people, and it allows you to then accept to relative degrees a certain amount of plurality that we all have to live with. So that is one of the arguments I make about the function of that temporality in the larger arc, and that's how a movement can globalize, right? If you want to think
Yeah.
about the globalization of religious forms, it requires a certain ethics of reflection on the limits of agency. I can't necessarily transform you, but I must still live with you. It's a kind of attempt. And this is what explains, in my argument, some of the great successes of Tablighi Jamaat that operate across all kinds of social and political landscapes. Their ability to embed themselves, pursue their project of producing a kind of pious formation, social formation, while living in the actual plurality of social thought.